Kiana Brooks thought winning the state track meet would be her ticket out of Harrow Pines, but as she jogged home under the Alabama dusk, her gold medal glinting, Officer Vernon Holt's cruiser screeched to a stop, pinning her in headlights, like prey. He stormed out snarling about a robbery, slammed her against the hood and planted a bag of pills in her backpack. Handcuffs bit her wrists as he sneered about teaching her a lesson, her screams drowned by sirens heralding a nightmare she couldn't outrun. What would it take for Kiana to escape this trap? Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice against corruption, hit that like and subscribe button, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Kiana Brooks sat on a cold metal bench in a grimy Harrow Pines holding cell, her track jersey still clinging to her sweat-soaked skin from the state meet just hours ago. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cracked concrete walls, and the air stank of bleach and despair. Her wrists ached where Officer Vernon Holt's handcuffs had bitten into her flesh, leaving angry red marks that throbbed with every heartbeat. She couldn't shake the image of his sneer as he'd shoved her into the cell, his voice dripping with venom, while he muttered about how girls like her always ended up behind bars. Now, as the clock on the wall ticked past midnight, Holt was in the next room, hunched over a desk with a flickering lamp, typing up a report that painted Kiana as a dangerous thief. He claimed she'd robbed Carter's pharmacy on the north side of town, beaten an elderly clerk with a lead pipe, and fled with a bag of prescription opioids stuffed in her backpack. Every word was a lie, but Holt didn't care about truth. He cared about control, about making sure Kiana knew her place in Harrow Pines, a town where black kids like her were guilty until proven otherwise, and even then, the proof didn't always matter. Kiana's hands trembled as she pressed them, against her thighs, trying to steady her breathing. She kept replaying the moment Holt had slammed her against his cruiser, the way he'd rifled through her backpack with those meaty hands and pulled out a plastic bag she'd never seen before. It wasn't hers. She didn't even know Carter's. Pharmacy had been hit until Holt started barking accusations in her face. But here she was, locked up, the weight of his fabricated story pressing down on her chest like a slab of stone. She glanced at the cell door, hoping for her mother's voice to break the silence, but the only sound was the faint scratch of Holt's pen and the occasional crackle of his radio. She didn't know how long she'd been there, hours blending into a haze of fear and fury, but it felt like an eternity before the door finally creaked open. Rochelle Brooks burst into the station like a storm, her waitress apron still tied around, her waist from a double shift at the diner on 5th Street. Her eyes were red-rimmed, tears streaking down her face as she clutched her purse with white-knuckled hands. She'd been pouring coffee for truckers when the call came in, a gruff voice on the line telling her that her 16-year-old daughter was in custody for robbery and assault. Rochelle had dropped a mug mid-pour, the shatter of ceramic echoing through the diner as her heart plummeted. Now, standing in the dimly lit station, she looked at Kiana behind those bars and felt her knees buckle. She steadied herself against the wall, her voice shaking as she demanded to see her child. Holt sauntered over, his boots clomping on the linoleum floor, and leaned against the cell door with a smirk that made Rochelle's stomach churn. He crossed his arms over his barrel chest and tilted his head, sizing her up like she was nothing, more than an inconvenience. "Your girl's in deep trouble, Rochelle," Holt drawled, his voice thick with mock pity. "Caught her red-handed with stolen pills and a bloody pipe. Ain't no bail tonight, not with charges like these. Best you can do is start praying she don't get sent up for a decade." He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that echoed off the walls, and Rochelle's hands curled into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream, to claw that smirk off his face, but she knew better than to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she swallowed her rage and forced her voice to stay steady, even as tears spilled down her cheeks. "My daughter didn't do this," she said, each word sharp and deliberate. "She's a good kid, an honor student, a track star. You got the wrong person, Vernon." Holt's smirk widened, his eyes glinting with something dark and cruel. "Good kids don't end up in my cells," he said, tapping the bars with one thick finger. "Your kind always does, though. Funny how that works." Kiana's heart twisted as she watched her mother fight for her. But the shame of being caged like an animal burned hotter than her anger. She wanted to shout that Holt was lying, that he'd framed her, but her voice caught in her throat, choked by the weight of her mother's sobs. Rochelle didn't have the money for bail, not with her tips barely covering rent and groceries, and the judge wouldn't hear their case until morning. So Kiana stayed locked up, the cell door slamming shut again as Holt escorted Rochelle out, his parting words a venomous promise. "I'll make sure the whole town knows what your girl did," he said, loud enough for Kiana to hear. "By sunrise, she'll be the poster child for every thug in Harrow Pines." True to his word, Holt didn't waste time. He called up a buddy at the Harrow Pines Gazette, a greasy editor named Carl who owed him a favor, and fed him the story. By 6 in the morning, the paper hit the stands with Kiana's name plastered across the front page in bold black letters. Local track star turns thug, teen arrested in brutal pharmacy robbery. The article painted her as a menace, a drug-addicted delinquent who'd thrown away her future for a quick score. And it didn't mention a shred of evidence beyond Holt's eyewitness account. The fallout was swift and merciless. Kiana's phone, confiscated by the cops but still buzzing with notifications, would have shown her the flood of messages pouring in from classmates, neighbors, even strangers who'd seen the paper. Some called her a disgrace, others said they always knew she'd turn out like those people on the south side, and a few tried to defend her but were drowned out by the mob. By 8 in the morning, Harrow Pines High School's principal, a pinched-faced woman named Mrs. Hargrove, called an emergency meeting with the school board. They didn't wait for a trial or even a statement from Kiana, citing the severity of the allegations and the need to protect the student body. They suspended her indefinitely, effective immediately. The decision was emailed to Rochelle's cracked old phone while she sat at the diner, staring at the newspaper headline with a cup of cold coffee trembling in her hands. But the worst blow came an hour later, when a letter arrived from the University of Alabama's track program, delivered by a courier who didn't meet Rochelle's eyes. The letter was short, formal, and devastating. Kiana's scholarship offer, the one she'd earned with years of sweat and speed, was rescinded due to recent developments that made her an unsuitable candidate. Kiana didn't hear about any of this until later that day, when a bored guard tossed a copy of the Gazette through the bars of her cell. She stared at her own face on the front page, a grainy yearbook photo that made her look harder, colder than she'd ever felt, and the words beneath it hit her like a fist to the gut. Suspended. Scholarship gone. Her future, the one she'd built lap by lap on the cracked asphalt of Harrow Pines' only track, was slipping through her fingers like sand. She crumpled the paper in her hands, her chest heaving with a mix of rage and despair, and pressed her forehead against the cool metal bars. She'd always known Harrow Pines wasn't fair, that the deck was stacked against kids like her, but this was different. This was personal. Holt wasn't just a racist cop, he was a predator, and he'd chosen her as his prey. She didn't know how, but she swore to herself in that moment that she'd fight back, even if it took everything she had. The cell felt smaller now, the walls closing in, and as the day dragged on, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of Holt's war against her. Kiana Brooks had spent 3 sleepless nights in that grimy Harrow Pines holding cell, her body aching from the hard metal bench, her mind racing with every tick of the clock on the wall. The fluorescent lights buzzed like a swarm of angry wasps, and the air felt thick with the stench of bleach and broken dreams. She kept replaying Officer Vernon Holt's sneer, the way his meaty hands had planted those pills in her backpack like it was nothing, like ruining her life was just another day on the job. Her mother, Rochelle, had been scraping together every penny from her waitress tips, but it wasn't enough to spring Kiana loose. Not yet. Rochelle had to do something, anything to get her daughter out of that cage before the town's venom sank any deeper. So she swallowed her pride and marched into the diner where she worked, her apron still stained with yesterday's grease, and begged her boss's brother, Marvin Tate, to take Kiana's case. Marvin was a local attorney, a wiry man in his late 40s with a salt and pepper beard, and a reputation for taking on lost causes. He wasn't some hotshot lawyer with a corner office. His desk was a cluttered mess in a strip mall storefront, surrounded by stacks of unpaid bills and photos of his own kids. But he had a heart, and when Rochelle broke down in tears telling him about Kiana's arrest and Holt's lies, he couldn't say no. Marvin pulled some strings and called in a favor with a clerk at the county courthouse, securing an emergency bail hearing for Kiana on the 4th day. The courtroom smelled of old wood and desperation, the kind of place where justice felt more like a coin toss than a promise. Kiana sat beside Marvin, her wrists still raw from the cuffs, her track jersey, swapped for a borrowed blouse that scratched at her skin. She glanced at Rochelle in the gallery, her mother's hands clasped so tight her knuckles turned pale, and felt a flicker of hope for the first time since Holt's cruiser had screeched to a stop that night. Marvin argued with a fire Kiana didn't expect, pointing out her clean record, her straight A grades, her track medals that had put Harrow Pines on the map. The judge, a tired-looking woman with grey streaks in her hair, seemed to listen, her pen tapping against the bench as Marvin pleaded for house arrest over jail time. After what felt like an eternity, the gavel cracked down like a gunshot in the quiet room. Bail was granted, but with a catch. Kiana would be fitted with an ankle monitor, confined to her mother's tiny Southside apartment except for court dates and lawyer meetings. She'd be free, sort of, but tethered to a system that already had her in its jaws. The relief was instant but fragile, like a soap bubble waiting to pop. Kiana hugged Rochelle outside the courthouse, the Alabama sun beating down on their shoulders, and for a moment she let herself believe she had a shot at clearing her name. Maybe this was the turning point, the moment where truth would claw its way out from under Holt's lies. Marvin seemed to think so too. He'd been digging, talking to folks around town, and he'd stumbled on something big. A bodega owner named Mr. Clarence, who ran a corner store across from Carter's pharmacy, claimed he'd seen Holt lingering near the pharmacy an hour before the alleged robbery. Clarence said Holt had been pacing outside, smoking a cigarette and muttering into his radio, looking twitchy as all get out. No one else had been around, not Kiana, not some shadowy thief, just Holt and his bad vibes. Marvin scribbled Clarence's statement in his notebook, his hands shaking with excitement, and told Kiana this could be the key to blowing Holt's story apart. A witness who put the cop at the scene before the crime? That wasn't just smoke, it was fire. Kiana let herself smile for the first time in days, imagining Holt squirming in court when Marvin dropped this bomb. Could this really be the break she needed to turn the tide? But Vernon Holt wasn't the type to sit back and let a small-town lawyer unravel his plans. Word got around fast in Harrow Pines, and it didn't take long for Holt to hear about Clarence's statement. He didn't waste a second. That same night, he rolled up to Clarence's bodega in his cruiser, the headlights slicing through the dark like a predator's glare. Clarence was sweeping the floor, about to lock up, when Holt barged in, his boots stomping loud enough to rattle the shelves. He didn't say much at first, just loomed over the counter, his shadow swallowing the flickering light from the old TV in the corner. Then he leaned in close, his breath hot with whiskey and malice, and told Clarence he'd better keep his mouth shut if he knew what was good for him. Clarence tried to stand his ground, said he wasn't scared of no cop, but Holt didn't play fair. He grabbed a bottle of bourbon off the shelf, smashed it on the floor, and called in a fake vandalism report on his radio. By morning, Clarence's store was boarded up. The old man slapped with a fine he couldn't pay, and his statement to Marvin was replaced with a shaky retraction. "Must have been mistaken," Clarence mumbled when Marvin came by later, his eyes darting to the street where Holt's cruiser idled like a vulture waiting for scraps. Marvin's heart sank, but he didn't tell Kiana right away. He didn't want to crush that flicker of hope in her eyes. Not yet. Holt wasn't done, though. Losing the witness was just the start. He wanted to make sure Kiana's little victory in court felt like a death sentence. 2 days after her release, while Kiana was still adjusting to the weight of the ankle monitor chafing her skin, Holt struck again. He waited until the dead of night, when the south side was quiet except for the hum of cicadas and the occasional bark of a stray dog. Then he slipped into Harrow Pines High School through a back door he knew the janitor left unlocked. For a smoke break. The halls were dark, the air thick with the smell of bleach and chalk dust, and Holt moved like a ghost, his flashlight beam bouncing off the lockers. He found Kiana's locker near the gym, the one with her name still taped to the door in faded blue marker. With a gloved hand, he popped the lock with a screwdriver, his movements quick and practiced. Inside, he stuffed a wad of crumpled bills, $500 in cash stolen from a drug bust he'd never logged, along with a burner. Phone loaded with fake texts, linking Kiana to a non-existent dealer. He didn't care if the evidence held up under scrutiny. He just needed enough to bury her deeper. By dawn, he'd tipped off a buddy in the school district, claiming he'd gotten an anonymous report about Kiana stashing proceeds in her locker. The school didn't hesitate. Mrs. Hargrove, the same principal who'd suspended Kiana after Holt's newspaper leak, called the cops herself, her voice trembling with self-righteous indignation. By noon, 2 officers, both Holt's drinking buddies from the station, showed up at Rochelle's apartment with a warrant. Kiana was in the kitchen, helping her mother chop onions for dinner, the ankle monitor blinking steadily on her leg. The knock on the door felt like a thunderclap, and before she could process what was happening, the officers barged in, their hands on their holsters, their eyes hard and unyielding. They didn't listen to Rochelle's pleas or Kiana's stammered protests. They dragged her back to the station, claiming they'd found stolen cash and a phone in her locker, evidence of ongoing criminal activity. The charges piled on like bricks on her chest: theft, possession of stolen property, and conspiracy to distribute. Holt was there when they booked her, leaning against the wall with a toothpick between his teeth, his smirk as sharp as a blade. "Told you I'd teach you a lesson," he muttered as the cell door slammed shut again, the sound echoing in Kiana's ears like a death knell. Kiana sat on the same metal bench she'd left just days ago, her hope snuffed out like a candle. In a storm. The ankle monitor was gone, replaced by handcuffs that felt heavier than ever, and the weight of the new charges pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. She thought about Marvin's witness, about the fleeting moment she'd believed she could win, and wondered if Holt would ever stop. How far would he go to keep her down? How much more could she take before she broke? Her mother's tear-streaked face flashed in her mind, and she clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. She couldn't give up, not yet, but as the hours dragged on in that cell, she couldn't shake the feeling that Holt was just getting started. What do you think about Holt's dirty tricks to silence witnesses like Clarence? Drop a comment with the number 1 if you think Kiana deserves a real shot at justice, and don't forget to like and subscribe to stay locked in for what's next. How do you think Kiana's fight will hold up when the whole town starts turning against her? Stick around to find out. Kiana Brooks was back in that same grimy Harrow Pines holding cell, the cold metal bench biting into her thighs, the fluorescent lights flickering like they were mocking her every ragged breath. It had been less than 12 hours since Officer Vernon Holt's cronies dragged her from her mother's kitchen, onions still scattered on the counter, the sting of their scent clinging to her fingers even now. The new charges, stolen cash and a burner phone planted in her school locker, had hit her like a freight train, piling onto the original robbery and assault lies Holt had spun 4 days ago. Her wrists throbbed where the cuffs had been yanked tight, and her mind churned with a storm of rage and helplessness. She couldn't shake the image of Holt leaning against the station wall as they booked her again, his toothpick rolling between his teeth, that smirk of his cutting deeper than any blade. She'd thought the house arrest and ankle monitor were the lowest she could sink. But Holt had other plans. He wasn't just out to ruin her. He wanted to bury her so deep the truth would never claw its way out. Word of Kiana's second arrest spread through Harrow Pines' south side like wildfire on a dry summer day. By noon, whispers turned into shouts as folks gathered in the cracked parking lot outside the police station, their voices rising in a chorus of fury. The south side had always been a tight-knit pocket of black families, where everybody knew. Everybody, where you borrowed sugar from your neighbor and swapped stories on sagging front porches. Kiana wasn't just another name to them. She was the girl who'd run laps around the block to train for state, the one who'd tutored their kids in math after school, the one whose gold medal had made them all feel like they could touch the sky for a fleeting moment. Now she was locked up again, branded a thug by a cop who'd been itching for an excuse to break someone. Her neighbors didn't buy it, not for a second. They'd seen Holt's type before, badge-wearing bullies who'd stop their sons for walking too slow, who'd rough up their daughters for talking too loud. Enough was enough. By 2 in the afternoon, the crowd outside the station had swelled to over 100 strong, spilling into the street with hand-painted signs and megaphones that crackled with static. "Free Kiana!" they chanted, their voices echoing off the brick walls of the station, shaking the humid Alabama air. Rochelle Brooks stood at the front, her waitress apron swapped for a faded sundress, her eyes red but fierce as she gripped a megaphone with trembling hands. She shouted until her voice cracked, demanding justice for her daughter, demanding that Holt be held accountable for his lies. Old men with canes stood shoulder to shoulder, with young mothers pushing strollers, their babies wailing in rhythm with the chants. Teenagers from Kiana's track team held up photos of her crossing the finish line at State, her smile wide and bright, a stark contrast to the mugshot Holt had leaked to the press. For a moment, it felt like the South Side might actually make the town listen, might force someone in power to open their eyes and see the truth. But Vernon Holt wasn't about to let a bunch of what he called rabble-rousers mess with his plans. From the station window, he watched the crowd grow, his jaw tightening with every shout of Kiana's name. He'd already silenced that bodega owner, Clarence, and planted more evidence to keep Kiana locked up. He wasn't going to let her protest, undo his work. He grabbed his radio and barked orders to his squad, rounding up every officer loyal to him, and there were plenty. By 3 in the afternoon, the station's parking lot looked like a war zone. Cops in riot gear poured out, their batons gleaming under the sun, their faces hidden behind visors that reflected the crowd's fury back at them. Holt took the lead, his beefy frame cutting through the line of protesters like a bulldozer, his megaphone blaring with a voice that dripped with contempt. "Disperse now or face the consequences," he roared, but the crowd didn't back down. They linked arms, their chants growing louder, their defiance a wall Holt couldn't break with words alone. So he broke it with force. On his signal, the officers charged, tear gas canisters hissing as they arced through the air and exploded into clouds of choking white smoke. The crowd scattered, coughing and screaming, their signs trampled under heavy boots. Mothers clutched their kids and ran, their eyes streaming from the gas while old men stumbled and fell, their canes skittering across the pavement. Holt's men swung batons with a vicious glee, cracking ribs and splitting lips, arresting anyone who didn't move fast enough. Rochelle took a baton to the shoulder, trying to shield a teenage boy from a blow, her cry swallowed by the chaos as she hit the ground. By the time the smoke cleared, 23 people were in cuffs, their wrists zip-tied tight, their faces bruised and bloodied. Holt stood in the middle of it all, his chest heaving, a satisfied grin splitting his face as he surveyed the wreckage. He called it a riot on the official report, claiming the South Side had turned violent, that they'd thrown rocks and bottles first. Another lie, but one the town's white North Side ate up like gospel. Inside the station, Kiana watched the whole thing unfold on a grainy TV mounted in the corner of the holding area, the news chopper's footage flickering across the screen. Her stomach twisted into knots as she saw her mother go down, saw her neighbors scatter like leaves in a storm, saw the cops drag folks away like they were nothing. Guilt clawed at her chest, sharp and relentless, tearing her apart from the inside. Out. This was her fault. If she hadn't been arrested, if she hadn't let Holt pin those lies on her, none of this would have happened. Her people were out there bleeding for her, and she was stuck in here, powerless to stop it. Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked, them back, her hands clenching into fists until her nails bit into her palms. She wanted to scream, to break something, to make Holt pay for turning her fight into their suffering. But all she could do was watch, her heart sinking deeper with every second of footage. Holt wasn't done twisting the knife. While Kiana sat in her cell, drowning in guilt, he was already working on his next move. He had a buddy in the tech department. At the station, a wiry guy named Dale who could edit videos faster than most folks could blink. Holt handed him a grainy clip from a body cam, one he'd forgotten to log after Kiana's first arrest. It showed her struggling against him that night on the street, her voice sharp with panic as she shouted that the pills weren't hers. Nothing incriminating, not really, but Holt didn't need real. He needed fuel. He told Dale to splice it. With footage from a separate incident, a grainy cell phone video of some other kid, someone nobody would recognize, smashing a bottle over an old woman's head. The final product was a choppy mess. But it did the job. Kiana's face, clear as day, screaming in the foreground while the old woman crumpled in the background, Carter's pharmacy sign flickering in the corner. Holt leaked it to a local news blog that night, no questions asked, and by morning it was everywhere, shared on social media, blasted on TV, whispered in coffee shops and barbershops across Harrow Pines. "Track star turns monster," the headline screamed, and the comments poured in, vicious and unrelenting, calling Kiana everything from a savage to a lost cause. The video didn't just turn public opinion against her, it lit a match to the whole town. The white North Side, already itching to believe the worst, took it as proof she was guilty, proof the South Side's protests were just a cover for more crime. Kiana's best friend, Tamika Harris, had been one of the few holding the line online, posting photos of Kiana's medals, screenshots of her straight-A report cards, anything to fight the tide. But the video broke something in the town's fragile balance. Tamika's posts got drowned out by a flood of hate, and then the doxers came for her. Someone leaked her address, her phone number, even her little brother's school schedule, pasting it all over message boards with threats that made her mother's hands shake. "Get out or burn," one message read. And it wasn't an empty threat, not in Harrow Pines, not with Holt fanning the flames. Tamika's family didn't wait to find out. By nightfall, they'd packed what they could into a beat-up sedan and fled town, heading for a cousin's place 2 counties over, their taillights disappearing into the dark like a fading hope. Kiana heard about Tamika from a guard who slipped her a note during a shift change, a crumpled scrap of paper with just enough words to break her heart all over again. "Tamika gone, had to run." She clutched the note in her cell, her fingers trembling as fresh guilt piled onto the old. First her mother's bruises, now her best friend driven out of town, all because of her. The TV kept looping that doctored video, the news anchors clucking, their tongues like they'd known all along she was trouble. Kiana's name was poison now, her face a target, her story twisted into something she didn't recognize. She pressed her back against the cell wall, the concrete cool against her spine, and tried to breathe through the weight crushing her chest. Holt had turned her fight into a war, and the South Side was paying the price. How much more could they take before they turned on her too? How long before Holt's lies swallowed everything she loved? Kiana Brooks slumped against the cold concrete wall of her cell in the Harrow Pines station, the flickering TV in the corner, still looping that doctored footage of her attacking some old lady she'd never met. Her ribs ached from sitting on that unforgiving metal bench for days, her wrists raw from the cuffs that had dragged her back here after Vernon Holt's latest frame-up with the cash and burner phone in her locker. The air was thick with the sour tang of sweat and bleach, and every creak of the station's old pipes made her flinch, expecting Holt's boots to stomp in with another lie to pile on her chest. She couldn't get the images out of her head. Her mother, Rochelle, crumpling under a baton in the protest chaos, her best friend, Tamika, fleeing town with her family after the doxing. Guilt gnawed at her like a starving dog, tearing chunks out of her soul with every breath. She'd been locked up for a week now, the walls closing in tighter each day, and the weight of the new charges, federal trafficking on top of robbery and assault, felt like a noose tightening around her neck. She kept whispering to herself that she wouldn't break, that she'd find a way to fight, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Outside, Marvin Tate was burning the midnight oil in his cluttered strip mall office, the glow of his desk lamp casting shadows across stacks of legal pads and coffee-stained files. He'd taken Kiana's case because Rochelle's tears had hit him where it hurt, but now it was personal. He couldn't stand seeing a kid with her fire get crushed by a system rigged to keep her down. Marvin had been digging through every scrap. He could find chasing leads while Rochelle worked doubles at the diner to keep their lights on. He'd lost the bodega owner, Clarence, to Holt's intimidation, but he wasn't giving up. Late that night, hunched over a lukewarm cup of coffee, he struck gold. A buddy who owned a gas station 2 blocks from Carter's pharmacy had kept a security camera rolling the night of the alleged robbery. The footage was grainy, the timestamp jumping from static, but it showed something clear enough to make Marvin's pulse race. A shadowy figure, tall and broad-shouldered, bolting out of the pharmacy's back door 10 minutes before Holt nabbed Kiana on the street. It wasn't her, no track jersey, no slender frame, just some hulking guy in a dark jacket hauling a bag. Marvin whooped so loud he woke his cat sleeping on the couch, then called Rochelle at 3 in the morning, his voice shaking with hope. "We got something, Rochelle. Something real." By sunrise, Marvin was at the station, banging on the desk until they let him see Kiana. She shuffled into the visitation room, her borrowed jail scrubs hanging off her like a shroud, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. Marvin slid the stills from the footage across the table, his fingers tapping the grainy image of the figure. "Look at this, Kiana," he said, his voice low but electric. "This ain't you. We can prove Holt's lying." Kiana stared at the photo, her breath catching in her throat as a spark flared in her chest. She traced the blurry outline with a trembling finger, her mind racing. Could this be it? Could this one shaky frame pull her out of this nightmare? Her lips twitched into a faint smile, the first in weeks, and she looked up at Marvin with something like fire flickering back into her gaze. He filed a motion to dismiss that same morning, rushing the paperwork to the courthouse with a copy of the footage on a scratched USB drive. The judge, the same gray-haired woman who'd granted house arrest, scheduled an emergency hearing for the next day, and Kiana let herself dream, just for a moment, that she might walk free, that Holt's house of cards might finally topple. But Vernon Holt had ears everywhere, and he wasn't about to let some gas station camera undo his work. Word of Marvin's motion hit the station by noon, whispered through the ranks by a clerk who owed Holt a favor. Holt's face twisted into a snarl when he heard, his beefy hands clenching into fists as he stormed out of the break room, coffee sloshing over his boots. He wasn't worried about the footage itself. He'd seen worse evidence shrugged off, by judges who didn't care to dig too deep. But he couldn't risk Kiana getting traction, couldn't let her think she'd won even a single round. He made a call to a lab tech he'd busted for DUIs a year back, a twitchy guy named Eddie, who'd do anything to stay out of jail. "Lose that USB," Holt growled into the phone, his voice low and lethal. "Make it look like an accident. Fry the drive, spill something on it, I don't care, just make it gone." Eddie didn't ask questions. By the time Marvin's motion hit the clerk's desk, the footage was a scrambled mess, the USB soaked in soda and sparking when they tried to plug it in. The clerk called Marvin with a sheepish apology, saying it was corrupted beyond recovery, and Marvin's stomach dropped like a stone. Holt didn't stop there. He wanted Kiana to feel the full weight of his wrath, to know she'd never outrun him. That night, while she slept fitfully in her cell, he slipped into her mother's apartment building, quiet as a shadow despite his bulk. The South Side complex was a maze of peeling paint and busted lights, and Holt knew every corner from years of shaking down tenants. He picked the lock on Rochelle's unit with a practiced flick of his wrist, the door creaking open to reveal the tiny living room where Kiana had spent her house arrest days. Holt didn't linger long. He pulled a burner phone from his pocket, one he'd bought with cash at a truck stop 50 miles out of town, and tucked it under the couch cushions, its screen loaded with fake texts tying Kiana to a drug ring he'd busted last month. He didn't care if the dates didn't match, he'd make them match. By morning, he'd tipped off a federal agent he played poker with, a guy who didn't ask too many questions about tips from reliable sources. The agent called in a raid, and before the sun was fully up, Kiana was yanked from her cell, hauled to a federal holding room 60 miles away in Montgomery, and slapped with trafficking charges that carried a 20-year minimum. Kiana stood in the new cell, a sterile box with steel walls and a single barred window, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The feds had stormed in with guns drawn, shouting about evidence found at her home, about texts she'd never sent, about a drug empire she'd never touched. She tried to argue, her voice hoarse and cracking, but they didn't listen. They shoved her against the wall, snapped cuffs on her wrists, and dragged her into a van while Holt watched from the station parking lot, his smirk back in full force. She saw him through the tinted window as they pulled away, his eyes glinting with triumph, and her stomach twisted into a knot of pure dread. The gas station footage was gone, Marvin's hope snuffed out, and now she was facing federal time, her dreams of law school and freedom crumbling into dust. She sank onto the cot in the Montgomery cell, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her face, and wondered how Holt kept winning. How many more moves did he have left? How much deeper could he bury her before she stopped clawing her way back up? Should Kiana have trusted Marvin's glimmer of hope, or was it always doomed with Holt in the game? Drop a comment with number 1 if you think she's still got a fighter's chance against this monster. Then hit like and subscribe to keep up with her battle. What's Holt cooking up next to make sure Kiana's buried for good? You'll want to stick around for that. Answer. Kiana Brooks sat on a thin cot in the Montgomery Juvenile Detention Center, 60 miles from Harrow Pines, her new home a steel-walled box that swallowed every sound but the echo of her own ragged breathing. The air was stale, heavy with the metallic tang of rust and the faint musk of too many bodies packed too close. Her wrists bore fresh bruises from the Fed's cuffs, her body still trembling from the whirlwind of the raid that had ripped her from the Harrow Pines station just yesterday. She could still see Vernon Holt smirk through the van window as they'd hauled her away, his eyes glinting with a sick satisfaction that made her stomach churn. The federal trafficking charges, tied to that burner phone Holt had planted in her mother's apartment, loomed over her like a guillotine, promising 20 years in a cage if she couldn't prove her innocence. The gas station footage, her one shot at freedom, was gone, fried by Holt's dirty tricks, and Marvin Tate's voice on the phone last night had been thick with defeat when he told her the news. Kiana pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to block out the memory of her mother's apartment, the couch where that phone had been stashed, the life she'd lost in a heartbeat. She was 16, but this place made her feel ancient, every hope she'd clung to slipping through her fingers like water. The detention center was a sprawling concrete fortress, its halls a maze of locked doors and flickering lights, guarded by officers who moved with the slow, deliberate pace of people who'd seen too much. Kiana kept her head down during her first day, shuffling through intake with a dozen other girls, her borrowed scrubs scratching at her skin as they fingerprinted her and shoved her into a holding pen. She didn't talk, didn't cry, just watched. The others with wary eyes, their faces a mix of defiance and despair. The guards barked orders, their voices bouncing off the walls, but one stood out. Officer Lena Carter, a black woman in her 30s with a short braid tucked under her cap and a gaze that cut through the chaos like a blade. Lena didn't shout, didn't swagger like the others. She moved with a quiet authority, her eyes lingering on Kiana during roll call, as if she could see the storm brewing under her silence. Kiana noticed it, but didn't think much of it. Not yet. She was too busy replaying Holt's smirk, too busy wondering how she'd survive this place when every corner felt like a trap waiting to spring. That night, as the cell block settled into an uneasy quiet, Lena pulled a double shift, her boots clicking softly on the polished floor as she patrolled the halls. She'd been at a dive bar in Montgomery a week back, nursing a beer after a long day, when she'd overheard Holt bragging to some off-duty cops at the counter. He'd been loud, slurring about a little track star he'd put in her place, laughing about planting evidence and watching her squirm. Lena had frozen mid-sip, her gut twisting as she pieced it together. The kid he was crowing about had to be Kiana Brooks, the girl whose name had been all over the news, the one who'd landed in her block that morning. Lena had seen enough crooked cops in her 10 years on the job to know Holt's type, power-drunk bullies who hid behind badges, but this hit different. Kiana wasn't some hardened repeat offender. She was a kid with a future, or she had been until Holt decided to play. God, Lena couldn't let it slide. She'd spent her career trying to protect girls like Kiana, not watch them get crushed by men like him. By the next afternoon, Lena found a moment alone with Kiana in the rec yard, a patch of cracked asphalt surrounded by chain link topped with razor wire. The other girls were playing basketball, their shouts echoing off the walls, while Kiana sat on a bench staring at the ground, her hands clenched in her lap. Lena approached slow, casual, like she was just checking in, but her voice was low and firm when she spoke. "I know you didn't do it, Brooks," she said, her eyes locked on Kiana's. "Heard Holt running his mouth about you. Guy's a snake, and I'm not here to watch him win." Kiana's head snapped up, her breath catching as she searched Lena's face for a trick, a lie, anything to tell her this was another setup. But Lena's stare was steady, her jaw set with a resolve that felt real. "What's that mean?" Kiana asked, her voice rough from disuse, barely above a whisper. Lena glanced around, making sure no one was close, then leaned in. Means I can help. I've got a recorder. If we get him on tape admitting what he did, your lawyer can use. You in? Kiana's heart thudded against her ribs, a mix of fear and hope clawing its way up her throat. She didn't trust Easy, not after Holt, not after everything, but Lena's words lit a spark she couldn't ignore. A confession from Holt. Caught. Raw and real. That could tear his lies apart, could get her out of this hellhole and back to her mother, back to her life. She nodded, quick and sharp, her fists unclenching for the first time in days. I'm in, she said, her voice stronger, now edged with a fire that had been buried too long. Lena slipped her a tiny digital recorder the next morning, hidden in a folded towel during laundry duty, and coached her on how to use it. She'd set up a call with Marvin, get Holt on the line under some pretense, maybe a deal to drop. The federal charges if Kiana confessed, and let Kiana record every word. By nightfall, the plan was in motion. Marvin made the call from his office, his voice steady as he fed Holt a line about Kiana breaking under pressure. Holt took the bait, his voice crackling through the jail phone as Kiana held the recorder. Close, her hands trembling but her resolve iron hard. Told you she'd fold, Holt laughed, his tone thick with smug pride. Planted that phone myself. She's done. Kiana's blood roared in her ears as she hit stop, the recording locked. In, Holt's confession clear as day. She handed it back to Lena during a midnight rounds check, her chest swelling with something dangerously close to triumph. Lena smuggled it out in her boot, promising to get it to Marvin by dawn. Kiana lay on her cot that night, staring at the ceiling, letting herself believe she'd finally landed a blow. Could this be the knockout punch? Could Holt's own words be the key to her freedom? She drifted off with a faint smile, imagining his face when Marvin played that tape in court, imagining the cell door swinging open and the sun on her skin. Again. But hope was a fragile thing in a place like this, and Holt wasn't out of moves yet. He got wind of the recording before it even reached Marvin's hands. A guard loyal to him, a hulking guy named Reese who'd grown up with Holt in the North Side, overheard Lena whispering about it during a shift change. Reese didn't hesitate. He called Holt that night, spilling everything for a cut of the poker. Winnings Holt always dangled as a bribe. Holt's face went red with rage, his fist slamming into his kitchen table hard enough to crack the wood. He wasn't about to let some nosy guard and a jailhouse recorder undo months of work. Lena was. The weak link. He'd start there. By morning, he'd leaned on the detention center's warden, a golf buddy who owed him a favor, and got Lena fired on a trumped-up charge of smuggling contraband. She was out by noon, her badge stripped, her braid swinging loose as she stormed. Out of the facility, cursing Holt's name. But Holt wasn't satisfied with just cutting her loose. He wanted Kiana to pay, to feel the cost of crossing him in her bones. That afternoon, Holt called in another favor, this time with a dealer he'd let off easy a year back. The guy had connections inside Montgomery Juvie, inmates who'd do anything. For a few bucks or a lighter sentence. Holt wired $500 through a dummy account and gave the order, take Kiana out. By evening, as the sun dipped below the razor wire, 3 girls cornered her in the shower block, their eyes hard and empty, shanks glinting in their fists. Kiana didn't see it coming until the first blow landed, a fist to her jaw that sent her staggering into the tiles. She fought back, swinging wild, her track-honed speed kicking in as she dodged a blade aimed at her throat. But there were too many, and they were too fast. A shank sliced into her side, hot pain exploding through her ribs, and another cracked against her arm, snapping bone with a sickening crunch. She hit the floor, blood pooling under her, her screams drowned by the hiss of the showers as the girls melted back into the block. Guards found her minutes later, unconscious, her pulse thready, and rushed her to the infirmary 60 miles from home, where she lay strapped to a bed, fighting to breathe through the agony. Kiana's world shrank to the beeping of a heart monitor, and the sting of antiseptic as medics stitched her up, her left arm in a cast, her side wrapped tight with gauze. She woke to a haze of pain meds, her mind foggy but sharp enough to know Holt had done this. The recording was gone, Lena was gone, and now she was broken, her body a map of scars from a fight she didn't start. She clenched her good hand into a fist, tears burning her eyes as she stared at the ceiling, the weight of Holt's revenge crushing her spirit. How much more could he take from her? How long before he finished what he'd started? Kiana Brooks lay strapped to a hospital bed in the Montgomery County Medical Center, 60 miles from Harrow Pines, her body a battlefield of bandages and bruises from the shank attack in juvie. The room smelled of antiseptic and rubber, the steady beep of the heart monitor cutting through the fog of pain meds that dulled her senses, but couldn't touch the ache in her soul. Her left arm was locked in a plaster cast, the bone snapped clean by a blow she barely remembered, and her side throbbed where stitches held together a jagged gash that had bled her dry on the shower block floor. Tubes snaked from her wrist to an IV drip, pumping fluids into her veins, while the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like a swarm of flies circling her broken dreams. She'd been out for hours after the surgery, her mind drifting through a haze of Vernon Holt's smirk, and the sound of those inmates' footsteps closing in. Now, awake and staring at the cracked ceiling tiles, she felt the weight of it all. The planted pills, the lost scholarship, the protests, the federal charges, and now this, a body as shattered as her hope. She clenched her good hand into a fist, nails biting into her palm, and tried to breathe past the panic clawing up her throat. Holt had done this, she knew it, and the thought burned hotter than the pain in her ribs. Rochelle Brooks burst through the hospital room door at dawn, her waitress uniform wrinkled from a sleepless night on a Greyhound bus, her eyes swollen from crying all the way from Harrow Pines. She'd gotten the call from the detention center while wiping down tables at the diner, the warden's voice flat and cold as he told her Kiana had been attacked, that she was in critical condition. Rochelle had dropped her rag and run, not even stopping to grab her coat, her heart pounding with a terror she couldn't name. Now, seeing her daughter strapped to that bed, tubes and wires tangled around her like chains, she choked on a sob and rushed to her side. She gripped Kiana's good hand, her fingers trembling as she pressed them against her daughter's skin, warm but too pale, too fragile. "Baby, oh God, baby," Rochelle whispered, her voice breaking as tears spilled down her cheeks. Kiana turned her head slow and stiff and met her mother's gaze, her own eyes glassy but fierce. "I'm okay, Mama," she rasped, the words scraping her raw throat. "Holt did this, he's trying to kill me." Rochelle's face hardened, her sorrow twisting into a rage she'd never let herself feel so fully before. She nodded, squeezing Kiana's hand tighter, and made a decision she'd been avoiding for 16 years. Rochelle sank into the chair beside the bed, her breath shaky as she leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper barely audible over the heart monitor's beep. "Kiana, there's something I gotta tell you," she said, her eyes darting to the door like she expected Holt to barge in any second. "Your father, he ain't just some guy who walked out. He's a big shot at the Department of Justice, been working undercover all these years, left us to keep us safe from his enemies from stuff like this." Kiana's breath hitched, her foggy mind struggling to process the words. A DOJ official, her father. She'd grown up with a blank space, where a dad should have been. Rochelle's vague stories about a good man forced out by circumstance, the only scraps she'd ever had. Now this? "His name's Terrence Marshall," Rochelle went on, her voice trembling with a mix of guilt and hope. "He's been watching you from a distance, knew about the track meets, the grades. I called him last night, told him everything. He's coming, baby, he's bringing help." Kiana's chest tightened, a storm of betrayal and longing crashing through her. Why hadn't he been there? Why now? But the flicker of hope was stronger, a lifeline in the dark. If he was DOJ, maybe he could stop Holt. Maybe he could pull her out of this abyss. Kiana didn't have long to wrestle with it. By noon, the hospital room door swung open again and two figures in crisp suits stepped in, their badges glinting under the harsh lights. The lead agent, a tall man with a shaved head and a scar across his cheek, introduced himself as Marcus Reed, special agent with the DOJ. His partner, a wiry woman with a tight bun, stayed quiet, her eyes scanning the room like she was mapping every exit. Marcus pulled up a chair, his voice calm but firm as he looked at Kiana. "We're here because of your father, Terrence Marshall," he said, his gaze steady. "He's Deputy Attorney General, been deep in covert ops for years. Got your mother's call and pulled us in to dig into this mess in Harrow Pines. Holt's on our radar now. Kiana's pulse quickened, her good hand gripping the bedsheet as she stared at him. DOJ agents here for her? It felt unreal, like a dream she didn't trust not to turn into another nightmare. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping. We're not promising miracles, but we're starting an investigation. You hang in there, all right? Kiana nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and for the first time in weeks she let herself believe she might have a real shot at fighting back. But Vernon Holt wasn't sleeping on this. He'd caught wind of the DOJ's interest through a mole in the Montgomery field office, a clerk who'd been slipping him intel for years in exchange for cash under the table. Holt was at his kitchen table when the call came, a half-empty bottle of whiskey sweating. Beside him, his face flushed with a rage that made his hands shake. Kiana was still breathing, still in the game, and now the feds were sniffing around. He slammed the bottle down, glass cracking under the force, and snarled into the phone. They don't get to touch me, not in my town. He wasn't about to let some suits from DC unravel his empire. Not after all the blood and sweat he'd poured into keeping Harrow Pines under his thumb. He needed to send a message, something big, something that would make Kiana and her fancy new allies think twice about crossing him. By nightfall he'd hatched a plan, his mind buzzing with the kind of cruel clarity whiskey always brought him. Holt waited until the moon was high, the hospital quiet except for the hum of machines and the shuffle of night shift nurses. He slipped into Harrow Pines under cover of darkness, his cruiser parked a mile out, his boots silent on the gravel as he approached Rochelle's apartment building on the south side. The place was a skeleton of itself now, half the tenants gone. After the protests, the rest too scared to make noise. He picked the lock with a flick of his wrist, same as he'd done to plant the burner phone, and stepped inside. The air was stale, the furniture untouched since the raid. A thin layer of dust coating the couch where Kiana had sat under house arrest. Holt didn't waste time. He pulled a gas can from his duffel, the slosh of liquid loud in the silence, and doused the room. Couch, curtains, the kitchen table where Kiana and Rochelle had chopped onions that last night together. He struck a match, the flame flaring bright in his cold eyes, and tossed it onto the soaked fabric. The fire caught, fast, roaring up the walls with a hunger that matched his own, the crackle of burning wood drowning out the cicadas outside. He slipped away as the flames devoured the apartment, the glow lighting up the south side like a warning beacon. Rochelle got the call from a neighbor at 2 in the morning, her phone buzzing on the hospital chair where she'd dozed off beside. Kiana. She answered groggy, then screamed, the sound tearing through the room as the neighbor stammered about fire trucks and smoke choking the block. Kiana jolted awake, pain shooting through her side as she sat up, her eyes wide with dread. What's happening, Mama? She croaked, but Rochelle couldn't speak, just sobbed into her hands as the truth sank in. Their home was gone, torched to ash by Holt's revenge. Kiana's heart sank, guilt crashing over her like a tidal wave. This was her fault, her fight, her defiance, her hope in that recording had brought this down on them. She stared at the IV dripping into her arm, her breath shallow, and wondered if Holt would ever stop. The DOJ was here, her father was coming, but what good was help if it just painted a bigger target on her back? The hospital room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, and as Rochelle wept beside her, Kiana clenched her jaw, her resolve hardening through the pain. Holt had taken everything, her freedom, her home, her body, but she wouldn't let him take her fight. Was Holt's arson a step too far, or just another move in his twisted playbook? Drop a comment with number 1 if you think Kiana's got the grit to rise from these ashes, then smash that like and subscribe to see her next stand. What's Holt got left up his sleeve now that the DOJ's closing in? You won't believe what's coming. Kiana Brooks woke to the sterile hum of the Montgomery County Medical Center, the beep of the heart monitor, a steady drumbeat against the ache in her stitched-up side, and the dull throb of her casted arm. The hospital room felt like a cage of its own. The walls painted a sickly beige that swallowed the weak morning light filtering through the blinds. Her mother, Rochelle, slept fitfully in a chair beside her, her face etched with exhaustion after a night of tears over their torched apartment. Kiana's chest tightened every time she thought about it. The South Side home where she'd grown up, reduced to ash by Vernon Holt's match, all because she dared to fight back. The IV drip clicked as it fed her fluids, but it couldn't wash away the guilt that clung to her like smoke, thick and suffocating. She'd been here 3 days since the shank attack in juvie, her body patched together, but her spirit fraying at the edges. The DOJ agent's visit yesterday, sparked by her father's call, had lit a fragile spark of hope, but Holt's arson had stomped it down hard. She stared at the ceiling, her good hand tracing the edge of her cast, and wondered if help from some shadowy DC suits could really stop a monster who'd burn her world to the ground. Special Agent Marcus Reed didn't waste time. He'd spent those 3 days digging into Harrow Pines with his partner, combing through decades of dust-covered files and whispered tips from scared locals. The DOJ team set up shop in a cramped motel room on the edge of town, the air thick, with cigarette smoke and the buzz of laptops pulling records from the Crestwood PD's archives. What they found made Marcus's scarred cheek twitch with a mix of disgust and determination. Holt wasn't just a bad apple. He was a whole rotten orchard. Complaints stretched back 20 years, planted evidence in a kid's backpack in '98, a black man beaten bloody for resisting in '05, coerced confessions from teens too terrified to fight back. Witnesses vanished, reports got lost, and Holt's buddies in the department always backed his play. Marcus cross-checked dates with Kiana's case. The pharmacy robbery lined up with a pattern of Holt targeting South Side kids, pinning crimes on them to pad his arrest. Stats. The gas station footage Marvin had lost, the burner phones, the cash in her locker, it all fit. By the 4th morning, Marcus had enough to march into the Montgomery hospital with a federal writ, his badge shining like a promise under the fluorescent lights. He found Kiana propped up in bed, Rochelle hovering close, her eyes darting between him and her daughter like she expected bad news to follow good. Marcus pulled the chair close, his voice low and steady as he laid it out. "We've got Holt's history on lock," he said, flipping open a folder thick with yellowed pages. "Years of corruption, all documented. Your case isn't isolated, Kiana. He's been doing this forever, and we're building a file to bury him." Kiana's breath caught, her good hand gripping the sheet as she listened. Marcus kept going, his scarred cheek creasing as he leaned in. "The feds are stepping in. We're pushing to get you back on house arrest while we investigate. Charges are getting scaled down. Robbery and trafficking are off the table for now just possession pending review." Rochelle's hand flew to her mouth, a sob breaking free as she squeezed Kiana's shoulder. Kiana's head spun, relief crashing over her, like a wave she didn't trust not to pull her under. House arrest. Again? No federal time. She could almost taste freedom even if it came with that damn ankle monitor strapped back on her leg. By noon, the paperwork was signed, and a nurse wheeled her out, Rochelle clutching her hand as they headed to a friend's cramped trailer on the south side, their only shelter now that Holt had burned their home to cinders. Kiana settled onto a lumpy couch in the trailer, the ankle monitor blinking red against her skin, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and desperation. Rochelle bustled in the tiny kitchen, trying to cobble together a meal from borrowed cans, her hands shaking but her smile fragile and real. For the first time in weeks, Kiana let herself breathe, let herself think she might have won a round. The DOJ was on it, her father's shadow pulling strings from DC, and Holt's empire was cracking. She pictured him sweating in his cruiser, his beefy hands twitching as the feds closed in, and it felt good. Damn good. Marvin Tate stopped by that afternoon, his suit rumpled but his eyes bright, and told her the recording from Lena might still be out there, maybe recoverable from a backup Lena had stashed before Holt got her fired. Kiana nodded, her jaw tight, and dared to imagine walking free, no monitor, no charges, no Holt looming over her like a storm cloud ready to strike. She leaned back, closing her eyes, and let that hope simmer, warm and alive in her chest. But Vernon Holt wasn't sweating. He was seething. He'd gotten the tip from his mole in the Montgomery DOJ office the night before Marcus showed up at the hospital, a quick text from a burner phone warning him the feds were moving fast. Holt sat in his kitchen, the same table he'd cracked with his fist when he'd heard about Lena's recording, A fresh bottle of whiskey open beside him. The DOJ digging into his past. Kiana back on house arrest? His mole had fed him every detail. Marcus Reed's name, the files they'd pulled, the writ that sprung her from juvie. Holt's face burned red, his knuckles whitening around the bottle, as he took a long swig, the burn in his throat matching the fire in his gut. He'd torched her apartment to send a message, but it wasn't enough. She was still in the game, still breathing, still a thorn in his side with those suits circling like vultures. He needed to hit harder, to make her fold for good, to show. The DOJ, they couldn't touch him in his own damn town. Holt's next move came fast and brutal. Tamika Harris had slipped back into Harrow Pines that morning, her family's flight after the doxing cut short by a cousin kicking them out of their cramped spare room 2 counties over. She'd heard Kiana was out of juvie, heard the feds were sniffing around, and figured it was safe enough to come home to stand by her best friend like she'd promised before Holt's lies drove her away. She was wrong. Holt had eyes on the south side, a network of snitches who'd sell out their own mothers for a 20. One of them spotted Tamika walking down Cedar Street, her hoodie pulled tight against the afternoon chill, and called it in. Holt didn't hesitate. He grabbed 2 of his dirtiest cops, guys who'd helped him plant the cash in Kiana's locker, and rolled out in an unmarked van, the kind nobody'd blink at on the south side. They snatched Tamika off the street. In broad daylight, her screams muffled by a gloved hand as they dragged her into the back, tires squealing as they peeled out. She kicked and clawed, but they zip-tied her wrists and ankles, her hoodie tearing as she thrashed against the cold metal floor. By nightfall, Holt had her stashed in a derelict shed 5 miles outside town, the walls rotting and the air thick with damp earth and rust. He loomed over her, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark, his voice low and venomous as he recorded a video on his phone. Tamika sat tied to a chair, her face bruised from a backhand he'd landed when she spit in his face, her eyes wide, with terror but burning with defiance. "Tell Kiana to confess," Holt snarled, shoving the phone closer, the red light blinking as it captured every word. "Tell her it's the robbery or your life. She's got 12 hours. Tamika's voice shook but didn't break as she stared into the lens. "Kiana, don't do it. He's a liar. Don't—" Holt cut her off with another blow, her head, snapping to the side, blood trickling from her lip. He stopped the recording, satisfied, and sent it to a burner phone he'd slipped to a Southside kid with orders to deliver it to Kiana's trailer by midnight. The kid knocked on the trailer. Doctor at 11:58, his hands trembling as he handed Rochelle the phone and bolted into the night. Kiana opened the video, her breath stopping cold as Tamika's battered face filled the screen, her friend's voice pleading through the tinny speaker. Rochelle gasped, clutching Kiana's arm, her nails digging in as Holt's ultimatum sank. In Kiana's heart pounded, her good hand shaking as she replayed the clip, Tamika's blood-streaked face searing into her mind. Confess to the robbery, the original lie that started this nightmare, or Tamika dies. 12 hours. The clock on the trailer wall ticked past midnight, each second a hammer blow to her chest. She thought she'd won, thought the DOJ had her back, but Holt had flipped the table again, turning her freedom into a trap. She sank onto the couch, her casted arm heavy against her side, and stared at the phone, the weight of the choice crushing her. Save herself or save Tamika? Holt wasn't playing anymore. He was ready to kill. How much more could he take before she broke? Kiana Brooks sat frozen on the lumpy couch in the borrowed Southside trailer, the burner phone trembling in her good hand as Tamika Harris's blood-streaked face stared back from the screen. The video looped in her mind, Holt's voice snarling, through the tinny speaker, demanding she confess to the pharmacy robbery within 12 hours or watch her best friend die. The trailer's walls pressed in, the air thick with mildew and the faint hum of the fridge Rochelle had left running while she paced outside, calling Marvin Tate in a panic. Kiana's casted arm ached against her side, her stitched-up ribs screaming, with every shallow breath, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror clawing her chest. Tamika's bruised eyes, her defiant plea, "Don't do it, Kiana," cut deeper than any shank ever could. Holt had torched their home, broken her body, and now he held Tamika's life like a bargaining chip, daring her to choose between freedom and loyalty. The clock on the wall ticked past 1 in the morning, each second slicing away at her resolve, and Kiana knew she couldn't sit still. She'd lost too much to let Holt take Tamika too. Her good hand tightened around the phone, her jaw clenching as she made up her mind. She'd find her friend, no matter what it took. Rochelle burst back inside, her face pale and her voice shaking. As she clutched her own cracked phone, "Marvin's on his way," she said, breathless, her eyes darting to the burner still glowing in Kiana's grip. "He says, don't do anything crazy, baby. The DOJ's still digging, they might—" Kiana cut her off, her voice hard despite the tremor running through it. "Mama, he's got Tamika. 12 hours. I'm not waiting for suits to save her." Rochelle's mouth opened, then closed, her hands wringing the hem of her shirt as she saw the fire in her daughter's eyes. Kiana stood wincing as her stitches pulled and grabbed a hoodie from a pile of donated clothes in the corner. The ankle monitor blinked red on her leg, a leash she'd have to dodge, but she didn't care. Marvin arrived 10 minutes later, his suit rumpled and his beard wild, his voice urgent as he stepped into the trailer's dim light. "Kiana, we can use this video," he said, pointing at the burner. "It's evidence." Holt's voice. "The threat. We take it to Marcus Reed, let the feds—" But Kiana shook her head, her good fist clenched. "Tamika doesn't have time for courtrooms, Marvin. I'm going after her." Marvin didn't argue long. He knew that look, the same stubborn grit he'd seen when she'd sworn to fight Holt from that first cell. He sighed, rubbing his temples, then pulled out a map of Harrow Pines he'd kept in his briefcase, spreading it across the trailer's wobbly table. "All right," he said, his voice low. "Holt's not stupid. He'd stash her somewhere off the grid, somewhere he controls. There's an old mill 5 miles west, been abandoned since the 80s. Cops use it for training. Means Holt's got keys." Kiana nodded, her mind racing as she traced the map with her finger, plotting a route past the south side's edge. She'd have to cut the ankle monitor, risk the feds hauling her back, but Tamika's life was worth it. Marvin offered to drive, his old sedan the only shot they had at moving fast without tipping off Holt's snitches. By 2 in the morning, they were rolling out, Kiana in the passenger seat, with a kitchen knife tucked into her hoodie, her casted arm awkward, but her resolve steel. She clipped the monitor with a pair of pliers Marvin dug from his glove box, the beep dying as they hit the dark back roads, the night swallowing them whole. The mill loomed against the horizon, a hulking skeleton of rusted steel and splintered wood, its windows black holes in the moonlight. Marvin parked a quarter-mile out, cutting the engine as Kiana slipped from the car, her breath misting in the chill Alabama air. She moved fast, despite the pain, her track-honed legs carrying her through the overgrown weeds, Marvin trailing close. With a flashlight he kept low. The shed Holt had picked was a detached shack behind the main building, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges, the faint sound of muffled sobs leaking through the gaps. Kiana's heart slammed against her ribs as she peeked through a crack. Tamika was inside, zip-tied to a chair, her face swollen and bloodied, her hoodie torn where Holt had roughed her up. 2 of his goons lounged nearby, their backs to the door, laughing over a pack of cigarettes, like this was just another night. Kiana signaled Marvin, her good hand gripping the knife, and they moved like shadows. Marvin lobbed a rock through the mill's main window, the crash pulling the goons out to check, leaving Tamika alone. Kiana slipped inside, her blade slicing through the ties as Tamika gasped, her eyes wide with relief and fear. "Kiana, you shouldn't," she started, but Kiana shushed her, pulling her up with her good arm. "We're getting out, now." They bolted for the car, Marvin leading the way. Tamika stumbling but alive, her breath ragged as they piled into the sedan. Kiana thought they'd made it, her chest swelling with a fierce, fleeting triumph as Marvin gunned the engine, tires, spitting gravel as they tore down the road. She'd beaten Holt, saved Tamika, turned his sick game back on him. But Holt had never planned to let it be that easy. He'd rigged the shed with a trap, a crude explosive wired to a gas canister he'd stashed under the floorboards, set to blow if anyone messed with his setup. The goons had tripped it, chasing the rock's noise, and as Marvin's car hit 50 yards, the shed erupted behind them, a fireball roaring into the sky, the blast wave rocking the sedan and shattering its back window. Shrapnel rained down, a jagged chunk slicing Marvin's shoulder as he swerved, blood soaking his shirt while Kiana ducked, glass cutting her cheek. Tamika screamed, clutching Kiana's good arm, the heat of the explosion searing the night air as they sped away, barely alive. Holt wasn't there to see it. He was back in Harrow Pines, sipping whiskey in his kitchen, waiting for word from his men. But the blast wasn't the end of his play. He'd already spun the story, calling in a tip to the state police as the flames lit up the horizon. Kiana Brooks torched the mill, he told them over a burner line, his voice calm and cold. Trying to destroy evidence, cover her tracks. Dangerous fugitive now. By dawn, the news hit every channel in Alabama, choppy footage of the burning mill looping with Kiana's mugshot plastered beside it, the anchor calling her a violent suspect on the run. A statewide manhunt kicked off, $10,000 on her head, cops and bounty hunters fanning out across the counties. Marvin, bleeding and dazed, dropped Kiana and Tamika at a roadside motel 20 miles out, his shoulder patched with a torn shirt as he swore to get the DOJ on it. Kiana sat on a sagging bed, Tamika beside her, both of them shaking as the TV blared their faces to the world. She'd saved her friend, but Holt had flipped it into a noose, tightening with every siren in the distance. Her victory tasted like ash, her freedom a lie. And as she stared at the flickering screen, she wondered how much deeper this hole could get. Did Kiana make the right call risking everything for Tamika, or should she have played Holt's game? Drop a comment with number 1 if you think she's still got a shot to turn this chaos into justice, then hit like and subscribe to catch her next move. How's Holt gonna top a freaking explosion to keep Kiana down? You're not gonna want to miss what's next. Kiana Brooks crouched on the sagging bed of a roadside motel, 20 miles from Harrow Pines, the TV's flickering glow casting shadows across her bruised face as it blared her mugshot to the world. The mill explosion still rang in her ears, the fireball's heat a ghost on her skin, the cut on her cheek stinging where glass had bitten her during their escape. Tamika Harris sat beside her, her swollen face cradled in her hands, her breath shaky after Holt's goons had beaten her. Bloody in that shed, Marvin Tate slumped in a chair by the door, his shoulder wrapped in a torn shirt soaked red from shrapnel, his voice hoarse as he swore he'd get the DOJ on this. The room smelled of stale smoke and desperation, the hum of the AC unit barely, drowning out the distant wail of sirens creeping closer. Kiana's good hand gripped the motel's frayed blanket, her casted arm heavy against her side, her stitched ribs throbbing with every move. She'd saved Tamika, cut her free from Holt's trap, but Vernon Holt had turned it against her again. The news called her a fugitive, a violent suspect who'd torched the mill to destroy evidence, a $10,000 bounty plastered on her name. Every cop in Alabama was hunting her now, and she had nowhere left to run. Marvin's. Sedan had barely made it to the motel before he'd passed out from blood loss. Tamika, shaking him awake long enough to get them inside. Kiana knew they couldn't stay. Holt's reach was too long, his snitches too many. But she didn't have a plan, not yet. Tamika's voice broke the silence, low and trembling, as she looked up from her hands. Kiana, what do we do? They think you did it. They're gonna kill you. Kiana's jaw tightened, her eyes flicking to the TV where a chopper's footage looped the burning mill, her face inset like a wanted poster. I don't know, she admitted, her voice rough with exhaustion. But I'm not letting Holt win. Not after this. Tamika nodded, her busted lip quivering, and Kiana felt a surge of guilt for dragging her back into this mess. She'd cut her ankle monitor to save her friend, but now they were both targets, and Marvin was bleeding out because of her. The weight of it pressed down, but she shoved it aside, forcing her mind to focus. She needed a lifeline. Someone Holt couldn't touch. That lifeline came at 3 a.m, a soft knock on the motel door jolting Kiana upright, her good hand fumbling for the kitchen knife she'd kept from the rescue. Marvin groaned awake, his hand on his shoulder, as Tamika shrank back against the wall. Kiana crept to the peephole, her heart slamming against her ribs, and saw a woman outside, grey hair pulled tight in a bun, eyes sharp behind thick glasses, her frame wiry but strong in a faded denim jacket. "Open up, girl," the woman hissed, her voice low but firm. "I'm Evelyn. Rochelle sent me." Kiana hesitated, then cracked the door, the knife still in her grip as she sized her up. Evelyn didn't flinch, just pushed past her into the room, her boots scuffing the carpet as she locked the door behind her. "Miss Evelyn," she said, nodding at Kiana. "Used to run with the Panthers back in the day. Your mama called me. When the feds took you, I've got a safe house on the south side. Holt's boys won't find you there." Kiana's shoulders eased, the name clicking. Rochelle had mentioned Evelyn once, an old friend who'd fought the system when it tried. To break her too, Evelyn didn't waste time. She sized up Marvin's wound, her lips thinning as she pressed a clean rag from her bag against it, then turned to Kiana and Tamika. "We move now," she said, her voice clipped. "Cops'll be here soon," heard the chatter on my scanner. She led them out back to a rusted pickup, its engine rumbling soft as they piled in, Marvin grunting in pain, Tamika clutching Kiana's arm. The drive was tense, the night swallowing the road as Evelyn wove through back streets, her eyes flicking, to the rear view for any sign of flashing lights. The safe house was a squat brick building tucked behind a row of abandoned shops, its windows boarded, its door reinforced with steel. Inside, it smelled of coffee and old books, a cot in the corner, a radio crackling with static. Evelyn patched Marvin's shoulder with a first aid kit, her hands steady as she stitched him up, then turned to Kiana. "You're a ghost now," she said, her tone hard but kind. "But you're not alone. I've got people who can reach your father. Terrence Marshall. He's your ticket out." Kiana sank onto the cot, her mind racing as Evelyn dialed a burner phone, her voice low as she spoke to someone on the other end, a contact who could get word to Terrence at the DOJ. By dawn, the line connected, and Kiana heard her father's voice for the first time, deep and steady through the crackle. "Kiana, it's me," he said, and her throat tightened, a mix of anger and relief choking her words. "I'm in Harrow Pines now, working with Marcus Reed. We're close. Holt's slipping. Stay put, we'll get you." Kiana nodded, even, though he couldn't see, and handed the phone back to Evelyn. Terrence had a plan. The DOJ had been chasing a lead on a hard drive Holt had buried years ago, a digital graveyard of his dirty deals, payoffs, frame-ups, beatings, all logged. In a file he thought no one'd find. Evelyn's contacts had tracked it to a storage locker on the north side, and Terrence sent a team to retrieve it. By noon, Kiana held the drive in her good hand, a scratched silver brick Evelyn's runner had smuggled in, its weight a promise. She could barely believe. If it was real, it could end Holt, could clear her name. She clutched it tight, her pulse hammering, and let herself think she'd finally turned the tide. But Holt's web was tighter than she knew. His mole in the DOJ, the same clerk who'd tipped him about Marcus's investigation, caught wind of the safe house chatter. The clerk didn't know Evelyn's name, but he knew Kiana was hiding, and he knew the feds were moving something big. He texted Holt from a gas station payphone at dusk, his hands sweaty as he relayed the intel. "She's Southside, got something you won't like." Holt was in his cruiser when the message hit, his beefy hands gripping the wheel so hard the leather creaked. His whiskey-soaked brain churned, piecing it together, the hard drive, the one he'd stashed after a botched deal in '09, the one he'd buried under a false name in a locker he'd paid cash to keep quiet. If Kiana had it, if the DOJ cracked it, he was done. His face twisted into a snarl, his boots slamming the gas as he called in a raid, pulling every dirty cop he could muster. By midnight, sirens wailed through the south side, Holt's crew smashing through Evelyn's steel door with a battering ram, their flashlights slicing the dark as they stormed in. Kiana barely had time to react. Evelyn shoved the hard drive into her hoodie, her voice sharp as she pushed her toward a back window. "Go, girl, now." Tamika grabbed Marvin, still woozy from blood loss, and they scrambled after her, but Holt's men were fast. A gunshot cracked the air, Evelyn's grunt echoing as a bullet tore through her chest, her body crumpling to the floor in a spray of red. Kiana froze, horror locking her legs, but Tamika yanked her through the window, glass scraping her arms. As they hit the alley, Marvin stumbled behind, his wound reopening, blood dripping onto the gravel as they ran. Holt stormed into the safe house, his boots kicking Evelyn's lifeless form aside, his roar of rage shaking the walls when he saw the window empty. Kiana clutched the drive, her breath ragged as they bolted into the night, sirens screaming closer. Evelyn's sacrifice burning in her mind. She'd escaped with the evidence, but at what cost? Holt was off the leash now, and as the south side lit up with flashing lights, she knew he'd never stop hunting her. Kiana Brooks crouched in the shadows of a south side alley, her breath misting in the chilly Alabama dawn, as sirens wailed in the distance, their echo bouncing off the brick walls, stained with years of neglect. The hard drive, Holt's buried, secrets pressed cold against her chest inside her hoodie, its weight a lifeline and a curse after the raid that had taken Miss Evelyn's life just hours ago. Tamika Harris shivered beside her, her bruised face tight with fear, her torn hoodie barely shielding her from the wind. Marvin Tate limped a few steps behind, his shoulder bleeding through the rag Evelyn had tied before the bullet ripped through. Her chest, his eyes glassy but fixed on Kiana with a stubborn grit. The safe house was gone, torched by Holt's men after they'd fled, Evelyn's blood soaking the floor where she'd fallen to give them a shot at escape. Kiana's good hand clenched around the drive, her casted arm throbbing, her stitched ribs screaming with every step, but she couldn't stop now. The manhunt was closing in, $10,000 on her head, cops and bounty hunters scouring the state, and Holt's mole in the DOJ had already proven he could reach her anywhere. She glanced at Tamika, then Marvin, and made the call she'd been dreading. No more running. "We turn ourselves in," she said, her voice low but firm. "This drive's our only shot, the trial's where we fight." Marvin nodded, his breath ragged as he leaned against the wall, his hand pressing the wound. "Terrence and Marcus can use it," he rasped. "Holt's done if we get it to court." Tamika's eyes widened, her voice cracking. "Kiana, they'll lock you up again." "What if—" Kiana cut her off, her jaw tight. "They've got nothing if this works. I'm not losing you again." She pulled the burner phone Evelyn had left, its battery flickering, and dialed the number Terrence had given her. His voice crackled through deep and urgent when he answered. "Kiana, where are you? We've got the locker raided. Hard drive's legit." "Stay low, I'm coming." She swallowed hard, the words heavy on her tongue. "No, Dad, I'm turning in. Meet me at the station with Marcus. It's time." The line went quiet for a beat. Then he agreed, his tone thick with something she couldn't name, pride, maybe, or fear. By sunrise, Kiana walked into the Harrow Pines station, hands up, Tamika and Marvin at her side. The hard drive tucked safe in Marvin's briefcase as cops swarmed them, cuffs snapping tight around her wrists once more. The trial kicked off too. Weeks later, the Harrow Pines courthouse a buzzing hive of tension under a grey October sky. Reporters crammed the steps, their cameras flashing like gunfire, while activists from the south side waved signs demanding justice, their chants clashing. With north side hecklers calling Kiana a thug, the courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, its pews packed with faces she knew. Rochelle in the front row, her hands clasped tight, Tamika beside her, still bruised but unbowed. Court officers lined the walls, their holsters glinting, keeping the crowd in check as Judge Pritchard took the bench, her stern face etched with lines that said she'd seen too many fights like this. Kiana sat at the defense table, her cast swapped for a sling, her stitches itching under a borrowed blouse, her ankle monitor back on and blinking red. Marvin stood beside her, his shoulder bandaged, but his suit pressed, the hard drive locked in an evidence bag beside him. Across the room, Vernon Holt loomed in his crisp uniform, his beefy frame filling the gallery seat, his smirk sharp as ever next to District Attorney Richard Vance, a slick man with a politician's grin and a voice made for twisting truth. The first day was a slugfest. Vance opened with a story that painted Kiana as a ticking bomb, a troubled teen whose hidden darkness had erupted in the pharmacy robbery, the mill explosion, the whole damn mess. "No prior record doesn't mean no guilt," he boomed, pacing the floor, his tie flapping as he waved the doctored video from Holt's leak, Kiana's face frozen mid-shout, while an old woman crumpled in the background. "She's a danger. A liar who will burn down anything to save herself." Marvin fired back, his voice steady as he laid out Kiana's truth, honor student, track star, framed by a cop with a vendetta. He dropped the hard drive on the table, its silver surface catching the light as he clicked it into a laptop, projecting files onto the courtroom screen. Emails of Holt rigging arrests, payouts to silence witnesses, logs of beatings stretching back decades. The gallery gasped, whispers rippling through the crowd as Holt's smirk faltered, his hands clenching in his lap. Vance objected, calling it unverified, but Pritchard let it play, her pen tapping as she squinted at the screen. By noon, the judge dropped the bomb. Charges against Kiana dismissed mid-trial, the hard drive's weight tipping the scales. Kiana's breath caught, Rochelle sobbing behind her as Marvin gripped her shoulder, his grin wide. She was free, or so she thought. Holt didn't flinch long. He'd known the hard drive could surface. He'd buried it deep, but not deep enough. And he'd prepped a fallback. As the courtroom buzzed with Kiana's win, he took the stand that afternoon, his uniform starched, his voice smooth as oil despite the sweat beading on his brow. Vance fed him softballs, letting him spin a tale of Kiana confessing to him months ago, a lie he'd kept quiet to give her a chance to come clean. Then he played his ace. Doctored audio, crisp and clear, pumped through the courtroom, speakers from a USB he slid to Vance mid-testimony. Kiana's voice, fake but flawless, crackled out, "I hit the pharmacy, took the pills, I'm sorry," her tone broken and small, nothing like the fire she carried. The gallery erupted. Southside supporters shouting it was a lie. Northsiders jeering she'd fooled them all. Marvin leapt up, his voice cracking as he objected, "Fabricated evidence, Your Honor." But Pritchard's gavel slammed, her face tight as she called a recess to review. Holt stepped down, his smirk back in full force, his eyes locking. On Kiana with a promise. He wasn't done. The recess stretched into chaos. Kiana sat stunned at the defense table, her good hand shaking as the audio looped in her head, a version of her she didn't recognize tearing her victory apart. Rochelle rushed to her, tears streaking her face, whispering it'd be okay, but Kiana couldn't hear past the roar in her ears. Outside, the courthouse steps turned into a battlefield. Protesters clashed with cops, signs snapping under boots, Northside voices screaming for Kiana's blood. "Lynch her!" someone yelled, the words slicing through the air like a blade, a ghost of Harrow Pine's ugliest past. Tamika grabbed Kiana's arm, her voice trembling but fierce. "They're lying, Kiana. We've got the drive, we've got—" She stopped as Marvin stormed back in, his face pale, his briefcase clutched tight. "Holt's playing dirty," he said, breathless. "That audio's new, cooked up fresh. He's betting the mob will finish you before we prove it's fake." Kiana's stomach dropped, the weight of the crowd's hate pressing down, the South. Side's chants drowned by Northside fury, egged on by Holt's allies in the shadows. The judge called them back by dusk, her voice sharp as she halted proceedings for the night, ordering the audio tested by a lab overnight. Kiana stood, her legs shaky. The ankle monitor's weight a cruel joke after tasting freedom for a fleeting hour. She'd thought the hard drive was her win, thought Holt was cornered, but he'd flipped it again, turning her triumph into a public whipping. The courthouse emptied slow, reporters swarming, activists shoving, cops barely holding the line as Rochelle pulled Kiana close, shielding her from the chaos. Marvin whispered they'd fight it, that Terrence and Marcus were on the case, but Kiana's eyes stayed locked on Holt as he slipped out a side door, his smirk cutting through the crowd like a blade. He'd lost the charges but won the town, and as protesters bayed for her outside, she felt the noose tightening again. How much more could Holt twist before the truth broke free? Kiana Brooks sat rigid at the defense table in the Harrow Pines courthouse, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and the murmur of a restless gallery as the trial's second day dawned under a heavy grey sky. Her cast was gone, replaced by a sling that cradled her healing arm, but the stitches in her side still pulled with every breath, a constant reminder of the shank attack that had nearly ended her. The ankle monitor blinked red on her leg, its weight a bitter irony after yesterday's fleeting taste of freedom, snatched away by Vernon Holt's doctored audio. That fake confession, "I hit the pharmacy, took the pills," still echoed in her ears, turning the Southside cheers into Northside jeers, the protesters outside now a howling mob baying for her blood. Rochelle sat behind her, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes red from a night of whispered prayers, while Tamika gripped her arm, her bruised face set with a defiance that matched Kiana's own. Marvin Tate stood beside her, his shoulder stiff under fresh bandages, his briefcase open with the hard drive glowing like a beacon of hope they'd fought too hard to lose. Judge Pritchard banged her gavel, silencing the room, her stern gaze sweeping over the crowd as she called for order, the lab report on Holt's audio clutched in her hand. The night had been a whirlwind. Marvin and Terrence Marshall, Kiana's father, the Deputy Attorney General she'd only just met, had burned the midnight oil with Marcus Reed, the DOJ agent, combing through the hard drive's files and chasing down the mole who'd fed Holt her safe house location. They'd traced the leak to a clerk named Simmons, a twitchy North Sider who'd been on Holt's payroll for years, his bank account fat with untraceable deposits. Marcus had hauled Simmons in at dawn, his badge flashing as he cuffed him in. A back alley, the clerk spilling everything, Holt's orders, the raid, the audio under the threat of federal time. The lab report came back just before court, confirming the audio was a fake, spliced from old radio chatter, and Kiana's voice lifted from a school announcement she'd made last year. Marvin clutched the report like a lifeline, his voice steady, as he stood to open the day. "Your Honor, we've got proof Holt's audio is fabricated," he said, sliding the papers to the bench. "And we've got a witness to bury him." He nodded to the back of the room and all eyes turned as Terrence Marshall rose, his tall frame cutting through the crowd in a crisp black suit, his face a mask of calm fury. Kiana's breath caught. As her father took the stand, his presence a jolt she couldn't shake. She'd heard his voice on Evelyn's burner, felt his shadow in Marcus's moves, but seeing him here, broad shoulders, greying temples, eyes like hers staring down Holt, hit her square in the chest. He swore in, his voice deep and unwavering. And Marvin stepped up, his questions sharp. "State your name and role," he said. Terrence leaned into the mic, his gaze locking on Kiana for a split second before sweeping the room. "Terrence Marshall, Deputy Attorney General, Department of Justice. I've spent 16 years on covert ops, infiltrating corrupt systems, police departments, cartels, you name it." The gallery buzzed, Pritchard's gavel cracking again as Marvin pressed on. "And your connection to this case?" Terrence's jaw tightened, his voice steady but laced with something raw. "Kiana Brooks is my daughter. I left her and her mother to protect them from my work's fallout. When I heard Holt was framing her, I came back, pulled every string to get here." Kiana's throat burned, anger and longing tangling in her gut as she stared at him, the father she'd never known stepping into her fight like he'd always been there. Marvin didn't let up. "What's on that hard drive, Mr. Marshall?" Terrence tapped the evidence bag, his voice cutting through the room's hum. "Years of Holt's corruption, emails bribing witnesses, logs of planted evidence, recordings of him beating confessions out of kids. I authenticated it myself, cross-checked with DOJ archives. It's ironclad." He pulled an affidavit from his jacket, signed with his clearance level, and slid it to the clerk, his eyes flicking to Holt, who sat rigid behind Vance, his beefy hands clenched white. Vance leapt up, his tie flapping as he objected. "This is last-minute grandstanding, Your Honor. Where's the proof he's even DOJ? What ties him to my client's innocence?" Terrence didn't flinch, his voice cool as he countered. "Simmons confessed this morning, Holt's mole. He's in custody, singing about every move Holt made, including that audio. And the drive's forensics? No prints match Kiana's, just an adult male's, likely Holt's." He nodded to Marvin, who handed over lab results, the room hushing as Pritchard skimmed them, her pen pausing mid-tap. The gallery erupted, Southside voices cheering, Northsiders shouting it was a setup. But Pritchard's gavel slammed harder, her face stone as she glared at Vance. "Overruled. I'll hear this out." Terrence kept going, his testimony a wrecking ball through Holt's lies. "The DOJ's launching a full probe into Harrow Pines PD. Holt's name's on every dirty file we've got. Kiana's just the latest victim." Vance tried to rattle him, pacing with a sneer. "You're a ghost who shows up now? Convenient. What's this prove about her?" Terrence leaned forward, his voice like steel. "It proves Holt's a liar who framed my daughter to save his skin. That audio's trash. The drive's truth." The room held its breath as Pritchard took the affidavit, her eyes narrowing at Holt, who'd gone pale, his smirk replaced by a twitching jaw that looked ready to crack. By noon, Holt's empire was crumbling. Pritchard admitted the hard drive, and Simmons's confession, her voice sharp as she ordered Holt detained on the spot. "Officer Holt, you're under arrest for evidence tampering, corruption and conspiracy," she said, nodding to the bailiffs. They swarmed him, his beefy arms flailing as cuffs snapped on, his roar of rage drowned by the gallery's chaos. Kiana's heart thudded, relief flooding her as Rochelle sobbed behind her, Tamika gripping her hand so tight it hurt. Marvin slumped into his chair, a tired grin breaking through, and Kiana let herself believe it was over. Holt cuffed, the drive validated, her name cleared. She glanced at Terence, still on the stand, his half-smile catching her eye, and felt a flicker of something, gratitude maybe, or a bridge she wasn't ready to cross. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Holt, his glare burning into her as he was dragged out. But she stood tall, her sling a badge of survival, thinking she'd finally won. But Holt had one last card, played from the shadows of his cell. He'd known the trial could turn, had prepped a failsafe when the hard drive surfaced. That night, as Kiana left the courthouse with Rochelle and Tamika, the South Side crowd cheering her name, Holt made a call from lockup, his voice low through a smuggled burner. He'd hired a hitman weeks back, a North Side drifter named Jace, with a rap sheet longer than his arm, paid $5 grand up front with a promise of 10 more to finish the job. "Take her out," Holt growled, his breath hot against the phone. "Courthouse steps tonight. Make it clean." Jace was already there, perched on a rooftop across the street, his sniper rifle glinting under the moon as Kiana stepped into the open, her sling stark against her dark hoodie. The crowd's roar masked his steadying breath, his scope locking. On her chest as she hugged Rochelle, her first taste of freedom cut short by a killer Holt wouldn't let die with his arrest. Kiana's world hung on a thread, the trial's victory a fragile shield against the bullet aimed at her heart. Kiana Brooke stepped out of the Harrow Pines courthouse into the cool October night, the South Side crowd's cheers washing over her like a wave she could finally ride. Her sling hung loose against her dark hoodie, the stitches in her side itching, but bearable. Her broken arm healing under the weight of a victory she'd clawed from Vernon Holt's grip. Rochelle clung to her good arm, her tears soaking Kiana's shoulder as she whispered thanks to a god she'd begged for months, while Tamika trailed close, her bruised face glowing with a pride that matched the fire in Kiana's chest. The hard drive had done its work, Holt's corruption laid bare, his mole exposed, his fake audio shredded by lab truth, and his arrest in court hours ago felt like a chain snapping free. The ankle monitor was off, cut by a bailiff after Judge Pritchard's final gavel, and for the first time in months, Kiana breathed without a leash. The air tasted sharp, alive with the scent of damp leaves and freedom, the North Side jeers drowned by South Side voices chanting her name. She hugged Rochelle tighter, her good hand trembling with relief, thinking Holt was done, his empire ash like her torched home. But as she turned to wave at the crowd, a street kid darted through, his eyes wide with panic as he shouted, "Get down!" Kiana's instincts kicked in, honed by months of dodging Holt's traps, and she yanked Rochelle and Tamika to the courthouse steps just as a crack split the night. A sniper's bullet whizzed past, grazing her ear with a sting of heat, embedding into the brick wall behind her with a puff of dust. The crowd screamed, scattering like startled birds, their cheers turning to chaos as Kiana dropped flat, her good arm shielding Tamika, her stitched side slamming the concrete with a jolt of pain. Rochelle hit the ground beside her, gasping, her hands clawing at Kiana's hoodie as footsteps pounded closer. Terence Marshall burst from the courthouse doors, his black suit tearing at the seams as he dove over them, his body a shield, while Marcus Reed and 2 DOJ agents sprinted out, guns drawn, scanning the rooftops. Another shot rang out, pinging off the steps, and Kiana's heart slammed against her ribs, Holt's final play flashing clear. He'd lost the trial, but not his hate. The sniper was his, a North Side shadow paid to finish what he'd started. From a jail cell 60 miles away, Terence rolled off, his voice sharp as he barked orders to Marcus. "Rooftop across the street, move!" The agents fanned out, their boots pounding pavement as the crowd thinned, Southsiders dragging each other to safety, North Side stragglers gaping like it was a show. Kiana pushed up, her good hand slick with sweat, and spotted the glint of a rifle barrel on a building opposite, the shooter's scope catching moonlight as he adjusted aim. She grabbed Tamika, pulling her behind a pillar, Rochelle scrambling. After, her breath hitching with sobs. Terence stayed low, his eyes locked on the rooftop, his hand gripping a radio as he called in backup. "Jace Tanner, Northside hitman, Holt's guy, get him now." Marcus led the charge, scaling a fire escape with one agent while the other circled the block, their shouts cutting through the night as the sniper fired again, the bullet ricocheting off the pillar inches from Kiana's head. She ducked, her stitched side screaming, and clenched her jaw, fury boiling over. Holt wasn't done. He'd burn her life to the ground, even in cuffs. The showdown came fast. Marcus reached the roof, his gun blazing as he traded shots with Jace, the hitman's silhouette jerking under a hail of bullets. The rifle clattered to the edge, Jace's body slumping beside it, blood pooling dark against the tar as Marcus kicked the weapon clear, his radio crackling with confirmation. "Target down," he said, his voice steady as he waved the all clear. Terence pulled Kiana up, his hands firm on her shoulders, his breath ragged as he scanned her for wounds. "You're okay," he muttered, more to himself than her, his eyes wide with a fear she hadn't seen in court. Rochelle clutched her, sobbing into her hair, while Tamika stood shaky but alive, her fists clenched like she'd fight the night itself. The South Side crowd crept back, their cheers hesitant now, the air thick with gunpowder and dread. Kiana's ear bled, a thin trickle warm against her neck, but she was whole. Holt's last shot stopped cold by a street kid's warning and her father's gamble. Back in Montgomery lockup, Holt got word by morning, a guard slipping him a note as he paced his cell, his beefy hands bruised from pounding the walls. Jace was dead, Kiana still breathing, the hit a bust. His snarl echoed off the concrete, his whiskey-soaked rage boiling over as he tore the note to shreds, but the noose was tightening. The DOJ's probe, sparked by Terence's testimony and the hard drive, had cracked Harrow Pines PD wide open. By noon, a federal judge slapped Holt with life without parole. Evidence tampering, corruption, conspiracy, and now attempted murder, the sniper's wire transfer traced to a dummy account he couldn't deny. His empire crumbled, his allies flipping under DOJ pressure, the Northside power he'd wielded for decades dissolving like smoke. Kiana heard it on the radio in Marvin's sedan, parked outside the courthouse, her breath steadying as Rochelle squeezed her hand, Tamika grinning through her bruises. Holt was gone, locked away forever, his final play a dud that couldn't touch her now. But victory came with a sting she didn't expect. Terence stayed after the chaos, his suit rumpled as he pulled Kiana aside in the courthouse lobby, the crowd thinning as night deepened. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, his eyes avoiding hers for the first time. She followed him to a quiet corner, Rochelle and Tamika waiting by Marvin's car, her gut twisting with a hunch she couldn't shake. He rubbed his neck, his jaw tight, and spilled it raw. "I knew about Holt years ago," he said, his words heavy with a guilt she hadn't seen coming. "Back in '09, I ran an op in Alabama, caught wind of his dirty deals, the beatings, the setups. Didn't dig deeper, didn't push. My career was climbing and I let it slide to keep my cover clean." Kiana's breath stopped, her good hand curling into a fist as his confession sank in. He'd known Holt was a monster, known he preyed on kids like her and walked away, leaving Harrow Pines to rot while he climbed the DOJ ladder. "I thought I was protecting you by staying out," he said, his voice cracking, "but I left you in his crosshairs. I'm sorry, Kiana." Her chest burned, fury and betrayal crashing through her like a storm. She stared at him, the father who'd swooped in to save her, the man she'd let herself hope for, and saw a coward who'd picked ambition over justice. "You knew," she said, her voice low and sharp, cutting through his excuses. "You could have stopped him before he ever touched me, before he burned our home, broke my bones, and you didn't." Terence flinched, his half-smile gone, his hands dropping limp as he nodded, taking the hit. "I failed you," he said, soft and broken. "I'll spend my life fixing it if you let me." Kiana stepped back, her sling swaying, her eyes hard as she shook her head. "I don't need you now," she said, each word a blade. "I fought this alone, me, Mama, Tamika, Marvin, Evelyn. You don't get to play hero after sitting it out." She turned, leaving him in the lobby's shadows, his silhouette shrinking as she walked to Rochelle's arms, her resolve a wall he couldn't breach. Kiana enrolled in law school a month later, her scars a map of survival, her dreams of fighting. For the defenseless burning brighter than ever. The South Side rebuilt slow, Rochelle moving them into a new place with Tamika's family chipping in, the community rallying around the girl who'd toppled Holt. Terrence slipped back to D.C., his calls unanswered, his visits rebuffed, a ghost she'd buried with her trust. Holt rotted in Montgomery, his cell a tomb for his hate, his name a cautionary tale whispered in Harrow Pines barbershops and porches. Kiana stood taller, her sling off, her stitches faded, her good hand steady as she signed her application, vowing to be the lawyer she'd needed, alone, unbroken, unstoppable. The nightmare was over, but the fight, that was just beginning. Kiana Brooks's journey in racist cop frame as 16-year-old black girl, then the DOJ reveals in court who her father is, offers raw, unflinching lessons about resilience, justice, and the cost of fighting systemic racism. First, it shows that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to push through it. Kiana faced arrests, violence, and betrayal, yet she never stopped clawing her way back, proving that inner strength can outlast even the darkest odds. Her story screams that one voice backed by grit can topple a corrupt empire. Holt's downfall came because she refused to fold. Second, it exposes how racism doesn't just strike, it festers, woven into systems meant to protect, like the police and courts that turned on her. Kiana's battle wasn't just against Holt, but a town complicit in his hate, a lesson in how silence fuels injustice. Third, trust is a double-edged blade. Terrence's betrayal, knowing Holt's crimes and doing nothing, cuts deep, teaching that even allies can fail you when ambition trumps duty. Finally, victory isn't clean. Kiana won her freedom, but scars lost homes, and Evelyn's death marked the price of truth. It's a gut punch. Justice demands sacrifice, and healing starts with owning that pain. This story isn't just a tale, it's a mirror. What would you do if the system turned on you? How far would you go to protect what's right? Drop a comment with your take, hit like if Kiana's fight lit a spark in you, and subscribe for more stories of unbreakable spirits. Share this if you believe truth should always outshine hate. Thanks for riding this wild journey with us. Here's to standing tall no matter the storm. Kiana Brooks thought winning the state track meet would be her ticket out of Harrow Pines, but as she jogged home under the Alabama dusk, her gold medal glinting, Officer Vernon Holt's cruiser screeched to a stop, pinning her in headlights, like prey. He stormed out snarling about a robbery, slammed her against the hood and planted a bag of pills in her backpack. Handcuffs bit her wrists as he sneered about teaching her a lesson, her screams drowned by sirens heralding a nightmare she couldn't outrun. What would it take for Kiana to escape this trap? Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice against corruption, hit that like and subscribe button, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Kiana Brooks sat on a cold metal bench in a grimy Harrow Pines holding cell, her track jersey still clinging to her sweat-soaked skin from the state meet just hours ago. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cracked concrete walls, and the air stank of bleach and despair. Her wrists ached where Officer Vernon Holt's handcuffs had bitten into her flesh, leaving angry red marks that throbbed with every heartbeat. She couldn't shake the image of his sneer as he'd shoved her into the cell, his voice dripping with venom, while he muttered about how girls like her always ended up behind bars. Now, as the clock on the wall ticked past midnight, Holt was in the next room, hunched over a desk with a flickering lamp, typing up a report that painted Kiana as a dangerous thief. He claimed she'd robbed Carter's pharmacy on the north side of town, beaten an elderly clerk with a lead pipe, and fled with a bag of prescription opioids stuffed in her backpack. Every word was a lie, but Holt didn't care about truth. He cared about control, about making sure Kiana knew her place in Harrow Pines, a town where black kids like her were guilty until proven otherwise, and even then, the proof didn't always matter. Kiana's hands trembled as she pressed them, against her thighs, trying to steady her breathing. She kept replaying the moment Holt had slammed her against his cruiser, the way he'd rifled through her backpack with those meaty hands, and pulled out a plastic bag she'd never seen before. It wasn't hers. She didn't even know Carter's. Pharmacy had been hit until Holt started barking accusations in her face. But here she was, locked up, the weight of his fabricated story pressing down on her chest like a slab of stone. She glanced at the cell door, hoping for her mother's voice to break the silence. But the only sound was the faint scratch of Holt's pen and the occasional crackle of his radio. She didn't know how long she'd been there, hours blending into a haze of fear and fury, but it felt like an eternity before the door finally creaked open. Rochelle Brooks burst into the station like a storm, her waitress apron still tied around, her waist from a double shift at the diner on 5th Street. Her eyes were red-rimmed, tears streaking down her face as she clutched her purse with white-knuckled hands. She'd been pouring coffee for truckers when the call came in, a gruff voice on the line telling her that her 16-year-old daughter was in custody for robbery and assault. Rochelle had dropped a mug mid-pour, the shatter of ceramic echoing through the diner as her heart plummeted. Now, standing in the dimly lit station, she looked at Kiana behind those bars and felt her knees buckle. She steadied herself against the wall, her voice shaking as she demanded to see her child. Holt sauntered over, his boots clomping on the linoleum floor, and leaned against the cell door with a smirk that made Rochelle's stomach churn. He crossed his arms over his barrel chest and tilted his head, sizing her up like she was nothing, more than an inconvenience. "Your girl's in deep trouble, Rochelle," Holt drawled, his voice thick with mock pity. "Caught her red-handed with stolen pills and a bloody pipe. Ain't no bail tonight, not with charges like these. Best you can do is start praying she don't get sent up for a decade." He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that echoed off the walls, and Rochelle's hands curled into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream, to claw that smirk off his face, but she knew better than to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she swallowed her rage and forced her voice to stay steady, even as tears spilled down her cheeks. "My daughter didn't do this," she said, each word sharp and deliberate. "She's a good kid, an honor student, a track star. You got the wrong person, Vernon." Holt's smirk widened, his eyes glinting with something dark and cruel. "Good kids don't end up in my cells," he said, tapping the bars with one thick finger. "Your kind always does, though. Funny how that works." Kiana's heart twisted as she watched her mother fight for her, but the shame of being caged like an animal burned hotter than her anger. She wanted to shout that Holt was lying, that he'd framed her, but her voice caught in her throat, choked by the weight of her mother's sobs. Rochelle didn't have the money for bail, not with her tips barely covering rent and groceries, and the judge wouldn't hear their case until morning. So Kiana stayed locked up, the cell door slamming shut again as Holt escorted Rochelle out, his parting words a venomous promise. "I'll make sure the whole town knows what your girl did," he said, loud enough for Kiana to hear. "By sunrise, she'll be the poster child for every thug in Harrow Pines." True to his word, Holt didn't waste time. He called up a buddy at the Harrow Pines Gazette, a greasy editor named Carl who owed him a favor, and fed him the story. By 6 in the morning, the paper hit the stands with Kiana's name plastered across the front page in bold black letters. "Local track star turns thug, teen arrested in brutal pharmacy robbery." The article painted her as a menace, a drug-addicted delinquent who'd thrown away her future for a quick score. And it didn't mention a shred of evidence beyond Holt's eyewitness account. The fallout was swift and merciless. Kiana's phone, confiscated by the cops but still buzzing with notifications, would have shown her the flood of messages pouring in from classmates, neighbors, even strangers who'd seen the paper. Some called her a disgrace, others said they always knew she'd turn out like those people on the South Side, and a few tried to defend her but were drowned out by the mob. By 8 in the morning, Harrow Pines High School's principal, a pinched-faced woman named Mrs. Hargrove, called an emergency meeting with the school board. They didn't wait for a trial or even a statement from Kiana, citing the severity of the allegations and the need to protect the student body. They suspended her indefinitely, effective immediately. The decision was emailed to Rochelle's cracked old phone while she sat at the diner, staring at the newspaper headline with a cup of cold coffee trembling in her hands. But the worst blow came an hour later, when a letter arrived from the University of Alabama's track program, delivered by a courier who didn't meet Rochelle's eyes. The letter was short, formal, and devastating. Kiana's scholarship offer, the one she'd earned with years of sweat and speed, was rescinded due to recent developments that made her an unsuitable candidate. Kiana didn't hear about any of this until later that day, when a bored guard tossed a copy of the Gazette through the bars of her cell. She stared at her own face on the front page, a grainy yearbook photo that made her look harder, colder than she'd ever felt, and the words beneath it hit her like a fist to the gut. Suspended. Scholarship gone. Her future, the one she'd built lap by lap on the cracked asphalt of Harrow Pines' only track, was slipping through her fingers like sand. She crumpled the paper in her hands, her chest heaving with a mix of rage and despair, and pressed her forehead against the cool metal bars. She'd always known Harrow Pines wasn't fair, that the deck was stacked against kids like her, but this was different. This was personal. Holt wasn't just a racist cop, he was a predator, and he'd chosen her as his prey. She didn't know how, but she swore to herself in that moment that she'd fight back, even if it took everything she had. The cell felt smaller now, the walls closing in, and as the day dragged on, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of Holt's war against her. Kiana Brooks had spent 3 sleepless nights in that grimy Harrow Pines holding cell, her body aching from the hard metal bench, her mind racing with every tick of the clock on the wall. The fluorescent lights buzzed like a swarm of angry wasps, and the air felt thick with the stench of bleach and broken dreams. She kept replaying Officer Vernon Holt's sneer, the way his meaty hands had planted those pills in her backpack like it was nothing, like ruining her life was just another day on the job. Her mother, Rochelle, had been scraping together every penny from her waitress tips, but it wasn't enough to spring Kiana loose. Not yet. Rochelle had to do something, anything to get her daughter out of that cage before the town's venom sank any deeper. So she swallowed her pride and marched into the diner where she worked, her apron still stained with yesterday's grease, and begged her boss's brother, Marvin Tate, to take Kiana's case. Marvin was a local attorney, a wiry man in his late 40s with a salt and pepper beard, and a reputation for taking on lost causes. He wasn't some hotshot lawyer with a corner office. His desk was a cluttered mess in a strip mall storefront, surrounded by stacks of unpaid bills and photos of his own kids. But he had a heart, and when Rochelle broke down in tears telling him about Kiana's arrest and Holt's lies, he couldn't say no. Marvin pulled some strings and called in a favor with a clerk at the county courthouse, securing an emergency bail hearing for Kiana on the 4th day. The courtroom smelled of old wood and desperation, the kind of place where justice felt more like a coin toss than a promise. Kiana sat beside Marvin, her wrists still raw from the cuffs, her track jersey swapped for a borrowed blouse that scratched at her skin. She glanced at Rochelle in the gallery, her mother's hands clasped so tight her knuckles turned pale, and felt a flicker of hope for the first time since Holt's cruiser had screeched to a stop that night. Marvin argued with a fire Kiana didn't expect, pointing out her clean record, her straight A grades, her track medals that had put Harrow Pines on the map. The judge, a tired-looking woman with grey streaks in her hair, seemed to listen, her pen tapping against the bench as Marvin pleaded for house arrest over jail time. After what felt like an eternity, the gavel cracked down like a gunshot in the quiet room. Bail was granted, but with a catch. Kiana would be fitted with an ankle monitor, confined to her mother's tiny Southside apartment except for court dates and lawyer meetings. She'd be free, sort of, but tethered to a system that already had her in its jaws. The relief was instant but fragile, like a soap bubble waiting to pop. Kiana hugged Rochelle outside the courthouse, the Alabama sun beating down on their shoulders, and for a moment she let herself believe she had a shot at clearing her name. Maybe this was the turning point, the moment where truth would claw its way out from under Holt's lies. Marvin seemed to think so too. He'd been digging, talking to folks around town, and he'd stumbled on something big. A bodega owner named Mr. Clarence, who ran a corner store across from Carter's pharmacy, claimed he'd seen Holt lingering near the pharmacy an hour before the alleged robbery. Clarence said Holt had been pacing outside, smoking a cigarette and muttering into his radio, looking twitchy as all get out. No one else had been around, not Kiana, not some shadowy thief, just Holt and his bad vibes. Marvin scribbled Clarence's statement in his notebook, his hands shaking with excitement, and told Kiana this could be the key to blowing Holt's story apart. A witness who put the cop at the scene before the crime?